So let's talk a little bit about exploring power in your project. And I think it's a little bit about simply doing an analysis or the conversation or discussion with your team that helps you unlock ideas and see the situation. This is very much that whole notion of curiosity, and see the situation in a more productive way for your project, okay? So looking at who holds power, who's given power, and most importantly, how you can use those insights and that perspective to benefit your team or your team's project and ultimately the community, okay? So we've not done this module before, and so I want to just state very transparently that I'm a student in this with you. And I've put together some thoughts and some resources for you today, but I'm no expert in power dynamics. In fact, I often told my colleagues when I was working with them, when they would bring up political power in the organization or who has what decision-making power, I'm like, oh, I don't care about any of that. I just want to do great work, right? And luckily, I had people around me who knew how to navigate those things and identify them. And I think a team is more successful when you do have people that are able to understand and look at the power dynamics of a situation. Now, what's pretty interesting for you guys is that power starts with your team. And I will be honest that all the teams I've coached across millennia, 20 years, 25 years, because I was a university professor as well, teaching the same kind of stuff at the graduate level. I'm going to shrink myself down a little bit here so I don't block the screen so much. And so I've coached hundreds and hundreds of teams and looked at projects over and over. And power dynamics within the team itself is always something to be conscious of and aware of. And so this week, as you're thinking about, yes, we're 6 weeks into it, but this week, think about maybe having a conversation with your team about power, and I'm going to give you some prompts for that, because it can actually unlock productivity in your team, okay? So I'm a student with you, and if you have exercises or references you want to share with the Catalyst community, we are completely open and welcoming to those references and suggestions from you. And that's how we'll build this content into the Catalyst program with more strength, more diversity of voice, etc. So I'm going to share with you some ways of thinking about power that could be helpful for your team, but also for your organization. Now think about this. If you start to do a good job at fostering reflective discussions on power and help your team get better, and then you can help your organization get better, this is stepping into your leadership as a catalyst. And so we all need to practice this. We all need to have these conversations about where power lies, what kind of power are we wielding, how can I better wield power that I have or that is given to me for the better, okay? And so finally, we encourage you to run a reflective conversation with your team about power, and it starts with conversation. None of this is about checking off the boxes in a rubric or a form. Like, it's really about using some prompts to get your thoughts down and then sharing those thoughts with others. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so I'm using a reference in my research that I felt particularly appropriate to start with in terms of looking at power and possibly dismantling bigger power structures, but also better working with each other in our own team. So this is a compendium of articles in problem solving in teams and groups, and it's chapter 14, and I found it particularly helpful. Oops. So first, let's talk a little bit about defining power, and then I'll talk about types of power. But they first start out by talking about these three ways that power can be wielded. Power over others enables one individual or group to make decisions that affect others and to enforce control of those decisions. So this is power over. But that's not the only way we can define power. We also have power from within. And as catalysts, you are calling on your power within to explore these methods, to have an open mind, to start with beginner's mind, to share your work before it's gone, before it's completely ready. Okay, we don't need that. Sorry about that. So power from within manifests itself when we can stand, walk, and speak words that convey our ideas, needs, and thoughts. And so this is safety within a team of being able to share what we think without worrying about repercussions. But it's also a type of personal power. And then power with, and I think this is the one that I love most within the context of the Catalyst program and any of the innovative work we do with communities, and that's the power of an individual or a team in a group of equals. The power not to command, but to suggest and be listened to begin something, an idea, a new way of doing things, and to see it happen. Isn't that ultimately what we're trying to do in Catalyst? So power over, power from within, and power with others. Power with others, where you're making suggestions and going with it. So think about how some of the Catalyst mindsets and some of the methods we've been talking about, giving and getting feedback generously, think about how that enables a much more positive form of power within your team and organization and the community members you work with. Okay, I'm going to go through 5 types of power, and I'm not going to go through every little guideline that they share here, but I'm going to go through the types of power because I think it's very interesting the many different ways power exists. And just by opening up our eyes to these variations, and already after doing this work, I've had some other ideas and within my context where I can identify other kinds of power. So legitimate power. This really manifests as authority, where one person feels another has the right to exert power in a certain domain. Okay? So this is really believing that, yes, that person is the decision maker or wielding power within this context. And I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to pretty much do what they say. It's almost like if it's legitimate, it's an agreed upon power. Okay? So somebody with legitimate power is cordial and polite. They need to show confidence. They need to be clear about follow-up and verify understanding, make sure requests are appropriate, etc. They need to exercise that power regularly because they are leading through that power. They are sharing direction and making things move. So, legitimate power. Coercive power. We all hate this. I hate this especially in the context of an organization because it's based on fear. And I think a lot of this occurs in the world. You very well know it. And coercive power is when a person can deliver a form of punishment to another. And so they can hold that over people and coerce them into certain behaviors. We see this, unfortunately, too prevalent in society. And in coercive power, there's still guidelines that they suggest. And we can see how even people with coercive power do not do it necessarily fairly or with appropriate authority. So, coercive power. Referent power. This is very interesting because it's really a basis of respect. Somebody looks up to another because of their characters, their qualities, their reputations. So referent power, reputational power, some people call it charisma. It's a different kind of power, right? And some of the guidelines: treat subordinates fairly, be sensitive to others' needs and feelings, engage in role modeling. This is when you stand for something, you have characters or qualities that people go along with the suggestions you make because you have referent power. Super interesting, these different kinds of power. If you're listening live, go ahead and say in the chat any of these that are resonating with you or that you see in your own organization or that you want to explore a little bit. Another type is expert power, based on expertise. A has credibility, knowledge, or expertise relevant to B. So this is almost like B, another person needs something or needs that knowledge or needs that understanding from that expert. Clearly within the context of the Catalyst program, I have expert power and privilege to be sharing my knowledge with you guys. And so the guidelines here are promote an image of expertise. Hopefully, I'm not promoting so much as living and sharing expertise. Maintain credibility, act confident and decisive. Avoid threatening subordinate self-esteem. That's a really interesting one as I think about it right now. You know, that whole notion where an expert can be disappointed with or disgusted that somebody can't get something, right? And you'll never see me like that in the Catalyst program. It's one of support and belief and my own responsibility to describe it in different ways and demonstrate and give good examples so that you're able to learn it. So an expert, I love all these guidelines because it helps us think about how to wield power in positive ways. And then finally, I think this is the fifth one, reward power. So some person controls rewards that B would like. So this is clearly if there are incentives or rewards within the workplace, who assesses and verifies that they were compliant with that. And so if you are in control of the rewards, then you have to be very careful about how you interact with people because they will have that idea of wanting to access those rewards. And of course, this is where corruption comes in. Some people have resources or value that somebody else wants, and they do it illegitimately, and that's corruption, right? So somebody holds a type of power that is able to give rewards to others, okay? Corruption and contract dealing, for example, in commerce. Okay, so those are the areas of power, and I put together you'll obviously have these slides, but I put together this quick one-page reference so that you can do it, but I also turned it into an exercise which starts with some prompts. So that reference is used in the exercise, but let's talk about some questions that maybe your team can use to get conversation started, to explore this notion of power, okay? So a great way to start is just thinking about yourself and the types of power you have. What forms of power are given to me? What forms of power do I give myself? Are there places, spaces, or ways in which I can share or give up power? Where? How? So in some of your teams that are working together, if you have somebody who is always kind of taking the lead, maybe that person, you, maybe you have power to give somebody else. What ways can I share my power with someone else and give somebody else voice or decision-making on our next steps in the project? And this is one of the hardest things for type A leaders, project leaders to do. But they're so important, and it's one of the ways you lead more is by giving others the ability to have voice and power within that context. And it's always appreciated. That's the odd thing is some people never see it. They continue to dominate meetings or projects, and they don't see that, like, wait a minute. Actually, we would be better off if I step back a little bit and support and help get out other people's ideas and then support some of those ideas, right? Okay. What forms of power do I see related to our project? So I just gave you a list of 5 types, plus power over, power within, and power with. So how can we think about which ones are those are most relevant to our project? Within our team, as we move this work forward in our organization, what power might we encounter or deal with, or who has decision-making power over us, et cetera, or over the work we do? And then in community, very sensitive to both your organization's power in the community, or maybe that's referent power, maybe that's expertise power, maybe that's reward power. If we're honest, CCI has reward power over grantees, right? They make grants, and so people want to do the best work possible. They want to please CCI, right? If we're open and transparent about how that kind of thing works, right? So what kind of power do you see related to your project? Which forms of power are harmful to myself and to others, right? Do you see any of those? Do you see things that cause less engagement with others? How could they be harmful? How can I harness the power I have to create positive change? So going back to your power within and the power that others give me and the power that I have by privilege or position, and how can I use that to create positive change? I think it's a wonderful question and such a meaningful way to use one's power. And then which forms of the power that we've identified in our project are helpful to myself or others, how and why, right? Just good prompts. So I turned this into, of course, a Miro template. So this is available across all team boards from within the templates in Miro. Again, if you're not sure where to get those, just shoot us a quick email. It's on the left-hand side. One of those buttons is a template. You open that up and go down to Shared at the bottom of the screen, and all of the Catalyst templates that we've shared with you will pop up, and this one will be the most recent one. And so what this has is the power types and guidelines on one board or on one frame, and then the prompts on another frame. So, you can use this with your team to just go in there 5-10 minutes, answer those questions, reflect, add your sticky notes, and then have a conversation. It's a great way to foster at least one conversation in your team that has to do more with dynamics and forces that are often not explicit. Make those explicit and make them work better for your team. Okay, I'm going to go back to, maybe I'll just go back to here and see what we got for comments and questions coming in. So Tanisha has one. What are some suggestions to get people, decision makers, to talk about power and how it lands on people in a harmful way? Yeah, so I think you probably asked this before I was through all the, maybe the prompts and the types of power. So I think you could always use the template we just put together and invite, maybe in a very small team, because you reference get people and decision makers. So who are those people you can invite to a conversation? And I would, this is the benefit of being a catalyst. I would experiment with your team first and to say, let's run a power prompt conversation. Maybe call it that, give it I think power prompt is a really catchy name that makes a lot of sense. So they're just prompts about power. Run that with your team first, and then think about, okay, who do we invite to a meeting, and run that again with them. And then you can start that meeting by saying, hey, we practiced this and we've tweaked the questions a little bit. Just remember, all these tools, you make them work for you. So you might take a question or two out. You might reword them that's more appropriate for your context. Yeah, great. So anyway, I think that's how you can get started. Again, you just have to invite people to a 30-minute conversation and then run that, facilitate that in a way, and it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but run that in a way where you're demonstrating leadership, empathy, transparency, and do your collaborative cycle. After you do that exercise, maybe have everybody stop and say, what can we take away from this conversation? How can we do it better next time? What ways might we broaden this in the organization, right? Think about doing these things in small steps. Think about the challenges you'll probably face in one or two of them. I mean, what's so hard in these conversations is people often accuse or blame or use language that can be hurtful. You got to be aware of that and bring that into the conversation and say, okay, maybe that's not the best way to phrase it. That's more blame. Can you talk more generally about the conditions of something like that, right? And then the facilitation is part of your job. Okay. And yeah, I agree, Melissa. I see, I'm pulling these from the article that I will share in comments before we go so you can download it. It's a good article. But yeah, subordinates, I mean, I think that's becoming a very dated word. Certainly in my organization, it would be dated. And I still freak out when people go, well, my boss says, it's like, you still call people your boss? But yeah. But definitely within the concept of referent and expert power. Nice. And Tanisha, thanks. Whoops, that's the other one. I wanted to put this one up. Yeah, these prompts are, and let me go down to the prompts. Yeah, these prompts can be helpful. And as a catalyst, do not fear, sorry, oh, I did it again. Do not fear making up your own prompts. I said I'm a student in this. I'm using a couple different references to come up with this type of thing and practice it in my own context, and hopefully you guys will practice it in yours. Okay, so I just want to share one short other thing with you. So let's talk a little bit about capturing and sharing your insights. This Friday, you will be sharing your research and some early insights with other teams, not because you're making a big presentation about all your findings, but because sharing work early and often is a highly productive practice and very beneficial to your work. So you're researching a wide range of areas, right? Everything from people's experiences through open-ended interviews, show and tell, observation. You're going and considering places and spaces, maybe getting a floor plan of where you're going to be operating, tools, the broader system, stats and figures, studies and research. Like there's a lot of stuff that you're trying to gather to better inform yourself about the state and context of your project, right? You're going to be a much better innovator and problem solver if you do that, because you're going to be aware of things. And just like the power dynamics we just talked about, if you're aware of those, you're more able to navigate things. Okay, so the question is, when you have all these things, okay, we gather them, and maybe we're having little conversations around them as I share what I found, but I want to encourage you to do a two-step process. One is the gathering of things and maybe documenting what you gathered, organizing what you gathered. And the second part is reflecting or asking questions about that, interpreting that information that you got, interpreting or reflecting on the interview you just did with somebody, okay? So, for example, in your interviews, one of the great ways just to break down an interview is to, in this column, let me see if I can do this, in this column of quote and action, right? These are what people said, and in this case it happens to be the workforce development work I was doing with youth, right? And so the quote or actions that they take, right, because it can be both something they said or something they do, I write those down in a spreadsheet cell. So participant A, I got 3 quotes from him, participant B, and this would go on 4 pages. Because if you have 5 or 7 interviews, then you're going to have 5 or 7 pages of quotes or points of view or things that people do that are worth putting down, right? So I'm capturing essentially the facts. This is what they said or this is what they did. But look at what's over here. Reflection, an insight, or a question. This is the interpretive part of it. This is the, what might that mean for our project? And this is what you should start doing with the work you're capturing. You can even do it with a conversation. Well, we do it in the collaborative cycle all the time. The collaborative cycle is generative activity, make all your ideas, organize them, and then reflection. What might these ideas we had or clusters that come out of this, what might that mean for our project? Because that's where the meaning is made. And it's not a, problem solving isn't a debate between whose idea you're going to do. Problem solving is gathering the facts or gathering the context and information and then looking at it and asking questions of it, interrogating what you're finding in a curiosity mode. And then eventually you'll get to framing where you want to have brainstorm and ideas and where you want to problem solve. But this is the important place where you can be creative without being saying, here's my idea that we should go do. It's like, let me read through this first one. Well, my uncle is in maintenance, and so I'll probably look for something there. He's talking about what careers or jobs he might think to pursue. And again, to remind people, these are high school, people who left high school and didn't finish and aren't going back to high school. And so one reflection or insight is he thinks about a career through his relatives' experiences. He only sees what's close to him and what he has access to. And so another reflection or question might be, how might we broaden their exposure to career paths? How can their view of what's possible to do in the world be so narrow and probably not in alignment with their passions, right? And so as I interrogate or I question or reflect on what my participants said, I get to insights. This participant B, I love poetry and write some every week, but my parents and teachers don't think there's a future for me in poetry. That's a direct quote that that a young lady told me. And then a reflection or insight. Poetry is writing. There are a lot of careers in writing. Like, I had this immediate thing like, oh, that's your passion. How do we build on your passion to find a career path when you're not going back to high school? How might we have them explore transferable skills that they are passionate about? So you're good at poetry. Poetry is this, this, and this. And what fields or careers might help you there. The only reason I'm going over this in a little detail is to show you that there's two modes. And you'll have lots of detail of things you've gathered and thought about, but now it's to start having those questions or insights. And the point here is that reflection on and interpretation of what you are gathering is an explicit activity that comes before ideas. Reflection and curious questions, noticing things about what you're finding, that's interpretation, helps your team develop meaning about the work that will lead to where we might decide to have ideas or problem solve or how we're going to frame the problem. And that's coming up in the next stage, right? Framing and ideation. That'll be in stage 3. It helps you develop insights and a productive framing of key opportunities and challenges, and to see the insight in the information that you're gathering. Okay. So a second technique, so that's very specific to like interviews where you have quotes and the way people do things. You know, one of those cells on an interview might be a little explanation of how somebody does something. So it doesn't just have to be quotes. It could be, here's how they file their paperwork, or here's how they take information when somebody comes into the agency, right? So you could have a little process in there, and then you could make observations about what they do. It's interesting that they do that without any support from others, or, you know. And so as you're thinking about it and interpreting it, you're getting more data about your reflections on it. Hopefully you guys are with me. Okay. Another technique to use, just the second one that I'm going to talk about, in the context of unstructured information that you're gathering, right? Whether it's research, whether it's interview notes. What I like to do after doing an interview, reading a few articles, gathering stats or figures, or making observations of activity that's happening somewhere. I keep pressing the wrong button. I write down my top 10 reflections about what I saw or heard. Because you notice things immediately when you do those. There's going to be things you didn't notice that you'll go back to through the recording or your notes, etc. Write down your top 10 reflections. After you get out of that interview, you're like, come back, you're like, wow, that was really great. Okay, what do I notice? What do I remember I noticed? And write those things down, right? And if you do a team interview where 2 people are present or 3 people, then you can do that in collaboration with each other, a little collaborative cycle. Let's write down 5 to 10 things that we all noticed, and then let's share and compare and build out that list and talk about why we noticed those things. And again, writing down some reflections on what that might mean for your project. So run back through your notes or recording content to support and refine those ideas or insights. This is the complicated name is constant comparative analysis. So you write something down, you go back and review your notes and your content and what people said to support it and refine your ideas. And then share those top 10 stories out loud with somebody else who's not involved in your project. Of course, it could be a team member, but share it with somebody else and go, hey, I just interviewed 3 people and here are my top 10 stories and what I'm taking away from that, or what I noticed and what I find interesting about them. I'd like to share that with you and then you tell me what you heard, right? Listen to their feedback and their questions. So this whole notion, and this is such a simple technique, and it's one of those things like a collaborative cycle that sticks with teams because it's easy to do and it's very productive. So after your team does a piece of work, somebody went off and did an interview, somebody else gathered some articles, write down and reviewed them, right? They read the articles and they maybe did some summary. Okay, out of all that, what did I remember? Write down your top 10 stories and then share them and then hear what you hear back. When you share them, you're forced to articulate something specific about the world and about the work. And just in that articulation and people going, I'm not sure what you meant by that, that's interesting. And then you refine what you say. Well, what I mean is what I think I saw was blah, or what I find interesting about that is X. And you're getting clearer and clearer. Remember last week we talked about clarity. So top 10 stories, the second technique, okay? So just remember that we're doing this in the context of sharing work early and often. So at the very start, you shared what you were excited about in your project, the things you're looking at, and you heard some feedback before you even got started, right? Now you're starting, now you're doing some interviews, now you're gathering information, and you're noticing things about that information. Document that in either just reflective comments or top 10 stories, okay? You're starting to document those, and then you're going to share them, and you're going to share them on Friday in our work session, if you're there with us live. And this is part of the sense-making for your project. And you shouldn't think about it as presentation. It's simply sharing. And you can be completely honest. Like if one of your interviews gave you nothing, and you're like, it was a complete waste of time, I heard nothing interesting. Even that is helpful. You should say that as you're sharing, because that's what you felt and experienced. And then others can say, oh, really? What did they say that was so boring? And you're like, well, they said this and this. And they're like, well, I find that interesting because blah, blah, blah. Or then you're like, oh, but wait, they also said this. And all of a sudden, you get some value out of that because you're sharing it, you're reflecting, you're articulating, you're listening to others. And it's a great way to move your work forward. Okay, so this I'm just putting in here because I think it's important to readdress. I shared it week 2, I think, about sharing your work early and often. Remember that this is a core behavior. It's not a mindset. You need the mindset of collaboration and diversity and inclusion to use this well. Like as soon as I get something done, I'm going to share it with somebody else because I value their input and I value their perspective on my work, no matter how early. Remember, when you're receiving feedback, you're listening, you're encouraging others to say more. You're not trying to explain yourself. You're not trying to defend your work. You're trying to listen and be clear. And you're looking to put others' ideas into your work, or onto your work in this case. And remember that after that feedback session, you can go decide how to move things forward. You don't have to agree or disagree within that session. And when you're giving feedback, you're listening to what they're saying. You're listening without judgment. You're writing things down that catch your attention that aren't clear. You're trying to make their work better, to be helpful. You're not looking to get your idea done through that team. You're not trying to convince them. And then we did talk about I wish, I wonder as a starting framework. And so you can use that. But as you start sharing interpretations, you will get feedback on the content itself. And it can be very specific from somebody. It's like, that insight is really powerful. You guys should bubble. I would vote that you bubble that up to the top, right? And you could always use it. You could always structure that within the I wish, I wonder framework. Okay. So that's all for the lesson today.